The last woman who remembered what they did to her name on that island never told the full story to anyone except one person, and that person kept it hidden in a tin box for 60 years. Her name was not the name she was born with. That is the first thing you need to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. The woman who died in a small apartment in Brooklyn in the spring of 1949 had lived under a name that was given to her by a stranger in a uniform, standing at a wooden desk in a building she had never seen before and would never fully trust again. She was 7 years old when it happened, and for the next 62 years she carried that name like a stone sewn into the lining of her coat. Heavy, always there, never quite hers. Her granddaughter, a woman named Dora, kept a tin box under her bed for most of her adult life. Inside that tin box were 3 things: a photograph of a ship, a piece of paper with writing on it in a language Dora could not read, and a small card, the kind they used to issue at Ellis Island, with a name printed on it in thick black ink that did not match the name in the photograph. Dora showed that tin box to a researcher from the Federal Writers Project in 1938, 11 years before her grandmother passed. The researcher wrote down what Dora said. He filed the transcript, and then, like so many thousands of documents from that era, it sat in a cabinet in a federal archive for decades, unread, uncited, and almost entirely forgotten. Almost. Because here is what nobody tells you about Ellis Island. The story you learned in school, the one about the tired and the poor and the huddled masses being welcomed through a golden door, that story is technically true in the same way that a map of a city is technically accurate. It shows you the streets. It does not show you what happens in the alleys. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million people passed through that single station on that small island in New York Harbor. 12 million. And a significant number of them, nobody has ever been able to agree on exactly how many, walked out the other side with a name that was not the one they arrived with, not legally changed, not formally processed, just different. Altered at the point of entry by men who were tired or impatient or working too fast, or who simply decided that the name on the manifest was too difficult and substituted something easier in its place. The official position has always been that this was a misunderstanding, a myth even. Scholars and archivists have written papers arguing that the name change story is largely exaggerated, that immigrants changed their own names later, voluntarily, for assimilation purposes, and that the inspectors at Ellis Island were more careful than popular memory suggests, and some of that is true. But some of it is also the kind of carefully worded denial that tells you more about what is being protected than what is being explained. Because when you go back to the actual testimony, when you sit with the actual words of the people who were there, the picture that emerges is considerably more complicated than the official version has ever been willing to admit. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment, the one whose granddaughter kept the tin box, her name at birth, had been a name from a village in a part of Eastern Europe that no longer exists under the same borders. It was a name with consonants that English speakers found difficult, a name that carried inside it the history of a particular family, a particular region, a particular religious tradition that stretched back further than anyone in that family could trace. When she arrived at Ellis Island in 1887, she was traveling with her mother and 2 younger brothers. Her father had come ahead of them 3 years earlier and was waiting somewhere in Lower Manhattan. The inspector who processed their papers looked at the manifest, looked at the name, and wrote something different on the entry card. Not similar, not a simplified version. Something different enough that when her father came to collect them at the ferry terminal, he looked at the card and did not immediately understand that it referred to his own daughter. She told this story to Dora many times, Dora told it to the Federal Writers Project researcher. The researcher wrote it down in a transcript that is now housed, if you know where to look, in the Library of Congress, not displayed, not digitized in any prominent database. Housed, which is a word that in the context of federal archives often means something closer to buried. What makes this particular testimony significant is not just the name change itself. Name changes happened. People who study immigration history acknowledge this, even if they argue about the scale. What makes this testimony significant is what the woman said about why it happened and what she believed it was meant to accomplish. Because she did not believe it was carelessness. She did not believe it was a language barrier or an overworked bureaucrat making an honest mistake. She believed, and she said this clearly enough, that the researcher underlined it in his notes, that the people processing immigrants at that island were operating under a set of instructions that nobody had ever made public. Instructions that had less to do with recording who was arriving and more to do with deciding who those people would be allowed to be once they got here. That is a significant claim. It is the kind of claim that sounds, on the surface, like the grievance of an old woman who lived a hard life and needed somewhere to place her anger. Except that when you start pulling the thread, when you start looking at what researchers and historians and archivists have quietly noted in footnotes and appendices that almost nobody reads, the thread does not break. It leads somewhere, and where it leads is considerably darker than anything they put in the brochures about the gateway to the American dream. This is the story of what she remembered. This is the story of what was done to 12 million names. And this is the story of what was done to 12 million names, and this is the story of why the people who should have told it to you a long time ago never did. To understand what was actually happening at Ellis Island, you have to first understand what Ellis Island was designed to be, and more importantly, what it was designed to do. Because the building itself, the great red brick structure with its towers and its vaulted registry room, was not built the way you build a welcome center. It was built the way you build a processing facility. And the difference between those two things is not architectural. It is philosophical. A welcome center is designed around the comfort of the person arriving. A processing facility is designed around the efficiency of the system receiving them. Every decision made in the construction and operation of Ellis Island, from the layout of the stairs to the positioning of the inspection desks to the flow of human traffic through the building, was made in favor of the system, not the person. The stairs are the first thing that matters here. When immigrants came off the ferry and entered the main building, they were directed up a staircase to the registry room on the second floor. What most of them did not know, what nobody told them, was that the doctors employed by the Public Health Service were watching them climb those stairs. They were watching for limps. They were watching for limbs. They were watching for labored breathing. They were watching for any sign of physical or mental deficiency that might, under the immigration laws of the period, make a person inadmissible. A chalk mark on the shoulder meant you were being pulled aside for further inspection. Different letters meant different suspected conditions. An X meant possible mental defect. An X inside a circle meant the suspicion was stronger. These people had traveled for weeks. They had survived conditions below deck on steamships that no health inspector would have approved. They were exhausted and disoriented and standing in a building full of noise and strangers, and they had no idea that the way they walked up a single flight of stairs might determine whether they were allowed to stay in America or sent back to a place they had risked everything to leave. This is documented. This is not contested history. The chalk marking system is described in official Public Health Service records, in the memoirs of inspectors who worked the island, and in the testimony of immigrants who went through the process and survived to describe it. And yet it is almost never included in the version of the Ellis Island story that gets told to American school children, because the version that gets told to school children is about hope and chalk marks on the shoulders of exhausted immigrants do not fit neatly into a story about hope. But the chalk marks are not the part of this that connects to what the woman in the Brooklyn apartment remembered. The chalk marks are the frame. What goes inside the frame is something that required considerably more deliberate effort to construct and considerably more deliberate effort to conceal. To understand it, you have to go back to the manifest system. Every ship that arrived at an American port with immigrants aboard was required to carry a manifest, a list of every passenger with specific information about each one: name, age, occupation, last place of residence, contact in America, amount of money carried, whether they had been to America before, whether they were anarchists, whether they were polygamists. The manifest was the document. It was the paper record of who you were before you became whoever America decided you were going to be. The inspectors at Ellis Island were supposed to verify the manifest against the person standing in front of them. They were supposed to confirm the information, check for discrepancies, and create an accurate entry record. On paper, this is what happened. In practice, on the days when a single inspector might be processing several hundred people, in a room that was loud and hot and filled with people speaking dozens of different languages, accuracy was frequently the first casualty of volume. And this is where the name changes that the official record has always called accidental begin to look. When you examine the specific patterns, considerably less accidental, because the errors were not random. That is the thing that the woman in the Brooklyn apartment had noticed, even as a 7-year-old child, and that she spent the rest of her life trying to articulate. The errors followed patterns. Names from certain regions were changed in certain consistent ways. Names that carried specific religious or ethnic markers were altered in directions that removed those markers. A name that identified its bearer as coming from a particular minority group within a particular country would arrive at the desk as one thing and leave the desk as something that could belong to anyone, something scrubbed of its geographic and cultural specificity. You could argue that this was coincidence. You could argue that certain sounds are simply harder for English speakers to approximate than others, and that the patterns reflect linguistics rather than intention. And that argument would be more convincing if the same patterns did not appear consistently across inspectors, across years, across multiple ports of entry, in ways that suggest not individual carelessness, but something closer to a shared understanding of what the goal was. The goal, if you follow the testimony and the documented patterns far enough, was not to record who was arriving. The goal was to create a population that was legible to the state, a population whose names could be filed, indexed, taxed, conscripted, and managed. Names that were too long, too foreign, too specifically tied to a place or a people that the receiving country had complicated feelings about. Those names were liabilities in a filing system. They were inefficiencies. And the men at those desks, whether they understood themselves to be participating in a policy or simply doing their jobs under time pressure, were resolving those inefficiencies the fastest way available to them, which was to change the name, and then file the new one, and then let 60 years pass until the person who remembered the original was almost gone. Almost. There is a word that archivists use when they are describing a document that has been deliberately made difficult to find. The word is obscured, not destroyed, not lost, obscured. Because destroying a document creates a gap, and gaps get noticed. Gaps invite questions. Gaps make people go looking for what used to be there. But a document that exists, that is technically accessible, that is sitting in a box in a climate-controlled room in a federal building somewhere, that document does not create a gap. It creates the appearance of transparency while functioning, in practice, as invisibility. You cannot prove something is being hidden when the thing is technically available. You can only note that nobody told you it was there. Nobody indexed it in a way that would lead you to it, and nobody has ever cited it in any of the official histories that get written about the period it describes. The Federal Writers Project testimony that Dora gave in 1938 falls into this category. It exists. If you know the specific collection, the specific box number, the specific folder within that box, you can request it and a librarian will bring it to you. But it does not appear in the standard indices. It is not referenced in the major academic works on Ellis Island immigration history. It is not part of the digitization projects that have made other WPA interviews searchable online. It is present in the way that something can be present while remaining for all practical purposes absent. And Dora's testimony is not unique in this respect. It is one of approximately 2,900 interviews conducted by the Federal Writers Project between 1936 and 1940 that deal specifically with the immigration experience, the Ellis Island processing system, and the question of what happened to names and identities at the point of entry. 2,900 testimonies from people who were there, from people who remembered, and the overwhelming majority of them exist in exactly the same condition as Dora's. Technically accessible. Functionally invisible. This matters more than it might seem to on the surface. Because the Federal Writers Project was not a minor undertaking. It was a massive, federally funded effort employing thousands of writers across the country, part of the New Deal infrastructure designed to put unemployed intellectuals back to work during the Depression. The project produced an enormous body of material: oral histories, state guides, folklore collections, life narratives from formerly enslaved people. The project is celebrated in certain academic circles for exactly this reason, for the extraordinary scope of what it preserved. The slave narratives in particular have been extensively digitized, studied, anthologized, and incorporated into the standard historical record. They are cited constantly. They are taught in universities. They are considered essential primary sources for understanding American history. The immigration testimonies are not treated the same way. And when you ask why, when you press the archivists and the historians and the academics who work in this field, the answers you get are interesting not for what they say, but for what they consistently avoid saying. You hear about funding. You hear about digitization backlogs. You hear about the sheer volume of material the project produced and the difficulty of prioritizing what gets attention first. These are all real factors. None of them fully explain why one category of testimony from the same project, conducted during the same years, by the same methodology, has been incorporated into the standard historical record, while another category has been sitting in boxes for 80 years. Unless the difference is not about resources, unless the difference is about what the two categories of testimony contain. The slave narratives tell a story that, however painful, has been officially acknowledged. The suffering they describe has been named, historicized, and incorporated into the national narrative in a way that, while incomplete and often inadequate, at least places it within the recognized framework of American history. The immigration testimonies tell a different kind of story. They tell a story about a process that was still ongoing when they were recorded, about a system that was still in operation, about decisions that were being made by institutions that still existed and still had reputations to protect. They tell a story that does not fit inside the framework of the gateway to the American dream. And frameworks, once established, have a very strong immune response to information that threatens to complicate them. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment understood this. She had understood it for most of her life. She had watched the Ellis Island story get told and retold around her, in newspapers and speeches and eventually on the radio, and she had recognized in each retelling the specific shape of an omission, not a lie, exactly, nothing as simple or as actionable as a lie. Something more sophisticated, a selection, a careful choosing of which parts of the truth were load-bearing in the official narrative and which parts could be quietly set aside without the structure visibly collapsing. She had a name for this kind of selective truth. She called it a polite erasure. And she used that phrase specifically, according to the transcript that Dora gave to the Federal Writers Project researcher, because she said that polite erasures were more dangerous than outright lies. A lie can be disproven. A polite erasure just requires everyone to agree, without ever saying so out loud, not to look too carefully at the empty space where something used to be. The empty space in the Ellis Island story is enormous. It is the size of 12 million names. It is the size of the specific, particular, irreplaceable identities that those names carried inside them. The regions and the families and the histories and the religious traditions and the linguistic inheritances that were compressed and altered, and in many cases simply discarded at a wooden desk on a small island in New York Harbor. And the reason that space has remained empty for as long as it has is not because nobody noticed. It is because noticing was never made convenient. The documents that would make noticing unavoidable have been sitting in boxes, technically accessible, functionally invisible, until now. In 1897, the original Ellis Island immigration station burned to the ground. The fire started sometime in the evening of June 14th, and by the time it was extinguished, the entire structure, a collection of wooden buildings that had been processing immigrants since 1892, was gone. The official cause was listed as accidental, a problem with the boiler, most likely, or possibly faulty electrical wiring in a building that had been constructed quickly and maintained inconsistently. The investigation was brief. The conclusion was neat. And within 3 years, the new brick and limestone structure that most people picture when they think of Ellis Island today had been built in its place, larger and more permanent and more efficient than anything that had come before it. What burned in that fire, along with the wooden buildings themselves, were the records. 5 years of immigration records. Every manifest, every entry card, every document generated by the processing of the approximately 1.5 million people who had passed through that station between 1892 and 1897 was destroyed, gone completely, not obscured, not buried in an archive, not technically accessible, but functionally invisible, simply gone. And this fact, the fact that the earliest years of Ellis Island's operation left behind almost no documentary record, is treated in the official history of the station as a tragedy, an unfortunate accident that created a gap in the historical record that genealogists and family historians have been mourning ever since. But here is the thing about that fire that does not get discussed in the official history. The records that burned were not the only copies. Under the maritime regulations of the period, every shipping company that brought immigrants to American ports was required to maintain its own copy of the passenger manifests. The manifests that the inspectors at Ellis Island were working from were not originals. They were working copies. The originals, or at minimum duplicate copies, should have existed in the records of the shipping companies themselves, in the port authorities of the European cities where the ships originated, and in some cases in the records of the foreign governments whose citizens were departing. A fire at Ellis Island should not have meant the complete destruction of 5 years of immigration records. It should have meant the destruction of one set of copies, with others remaining intact and available for reconstruction. The reconstruction never happened. Some of the shipping company records survived and have been partially incorporated into genealogical databases. But a systematic effort to reconstruct the pre-1897 Ellis Island records from the multiple sources that should have existed, that effort was never made. The gap was noted, mourned, and then accepted, which is a strange response to the accidental destruction of records that could theoretically have been partially recovered, unless the gap was more useful than the records would have been. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment arrived in 1887. Her entry, if it was ever recorded in the way it should have been, would have been in exactly the records that burned in 1897. Her original name, the name she was born with, the name the inspector replaced with something else at the processing desk, would have been in those records. The manifest from her ship would have been in those records. Any documentation of the discrepancy between what the manifest said and what the entry card recorded would have been in those records. And then the building burned, and the records were gone. And the official investigation was brief, and the conclusion was neat. And within 3 years there was a new brick building standing where the wooden one had been, larger and more permanent and more efficient, and nobody went back to reconstruct what had been lost. This is the pattern that the woman in the Brooklyn apartment spent 60 years trying to get people to see. Not any single event. Not the name change alone, or the fire alone, or the missing records alone. The pattern, the way that the moments when documentation of a particular kind of truth became most dangerous also turned out to be the moments when that documentation most reliably disappeared. She was not a conspiracy theorist. She was a woman who had watched a specific thing happen to her own name and had spent her life noticing the ways in which the systems around her consistently produced outcomes that made that thing harder to prove, harder to trace, and harder to remember. She noticed, for instance, the way that Ellis Island itself was memorialized. The station closed in 1954 and fell into disrepair for decades before being restored and reopened as a museum in 1990. The restoration was celebrated as a triumph of historical preservation. The museum that was created from it won awards. It became one of the most visited sites in the United States. And the story it told, the story that millions of Americans have walked through in the years since, is a story about arrival and hope and the courage of people who crossed an ocean to build a new life. It is a genuinely moving story. It contains real history, and it is also, in the specific ways that matter most to understanding what actually happened in that building, profoundly incomplete. The museum does not prominently feature the chalk marking system. It does not prominently feature the statistical reality that between 1892 and 1954, somewhere between 250,000 and 350,000 people were detained at Ellis Island, some for days, some for weeks, some for months, and that a significant number of them were eventually deported back to the countries they had risked everything to leave. It does not prominently feature the testimony of the people who experienced the processing system as something other than a welcome. It features the architecture. It features the photographs. It features the names on the wall, the American Immigrant Wall of Honor, which is itself a deeply strange artifact when you understand that many of the names inscribed on it are not the names those immigrants were born with, but the names they were given or took upon arrival. A wall of honor built from altered names commemorating a process that altered them, presented as a celebration of the people who were altered. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment would have had something to say about that wall. She would have recognized it immediately for what it was, another polite erasure, present enough to seem complete, incomplete enough to protect something. There is a name for the kind of memory that survives when official records do not. Historians call it oral history. Governments call it anecdotal. The difference between those two descriptions tells you almost everything you need to know about who controls the boundary between what counts as evidence and what counts as story. Because oral history is, in the most fundamental sense, the oldest form of record-keeping that human beings have. Before there were archives, before there were filing systems, before there were manifest lists and entry cards and federal databases, there were people who remembered things and told those things to other people who remembered them in turn. The entire body of human knowledge that predates writing exists in this form. And yet somewhere in the transition to institutional record-keeping, oral testimony acquired a secondary status, a kind of epistemic demotion that positioned it as less reliable, less authoritative, and less worthy of serious consideration than a piece of paper generated by a government office. Even when, and this is the part that requires careful attention, even when the piece of paper and the oral testimony directly contradict each other. Dora was not the only grandchild who kept a tin box. This is something that becomes clear when you start looking at the Federal Writers Project immigration testimonies as a body of evidence rather than as isolated individual accounts. Across those 2,900 interviews, across the different cities and neighborhoods and ethnic communities where the researchers conducted them, certain elements recur with a consistency that is difficult to explain if you believe each account is simply the isolated memory of a single individual processing their own experience. The tin boxes recur, not literally tin boxes in every case, but the object, the container of documents that the family kept hidden, that the grandmother or the grandfather referred to but never fully explained, that contained papers in a language the American-born children could not read. That object appears in testimony after testimony, after testimony, and what the object consistently represents, across all those different families and all those different communities, is the same thing. The gap between who the family was before they arrived and who the official record said they were afterward. The specific content of those containers varied. Sometimes it was a photograph, sometimes it was a letter, sometimes it was a religious document, a certificate of some kind that carried the original name and the original community affiliation in a form that the processing desk at Ellis Island had no way to reach. These objects were kept not because the families were sentimental, though they may have been, but because the families understood, at a level that did not require articulation, that the document in the tin box was the only remaining proof of something that the official record had erased. They were keeping evidence. They were keeping it in the way that people keep evidence when they understand that the institution they are dealing with is not neutral, that it has interests of its own, and that those interests do not always align with the preservation of the truth about what happened to you. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment kept her evidence for 62 years. She kept it through the death of her husband and the raising of her children and the slow accumulation of an American life in a Brooklyn apartment that was never quite large enough and never quite warm enough in winter. She kept it through 2 world wars and a depression and the specific daily erasure of being a person whose name was not her name, whose official identity was a substitution, who had to answer to something that belonged to a stranger at a desk on an island rather than to the family she had come from. She kept it because she understood that the day might come when someone would want to know, when the distance between the official version and the true version would matter enough to someone that the evidence in the tin box would finally serve the purpose she had always believed it was meant to serve. That day, in a formal institutional sense, has not fully arrived yet. The 2,900 Federal Writers Project immigration testimonies remain where they have always been. The digitization projects that have transformed access to other categories of historical material have not reached them in any systematic way. The academics who specialize in immigration history cite them occasionally, in footnotes, as supplementary color rather than as primary evidence. The museums and the memorials and the official histories continue to tell the version of the Ellis Island story that was constructed in the decades after the station closed, the version built on the records that survived, the records that were generated by the processing system itself, the records that by their nature reflect the system's account of what happened, rather than the account of the people who passed through it. And this is the epistemological problem at the heart of the entire Ellis Island historical record. The evidence that survives most completely is the evidence generated by the institution doing the processing, the manifests, the entry cards, the statistical reports, the administrative correspondence between the station and the Bureau of Immigration in Washington. All of this material is relatively well preserved, relatively well indexed, and relatively well incorporated into the standard histories. It is the institution's record of itself. And institutions, when they generate records of themselves, do not typically include in those records the testimony of the people who experience the institution as harmful, as arbitrary, as operating according to undisclosed instructions that had less to do with welcome and more to do with control. The testimony of those people exists in the tin boxes. It exists in the Federal Writers Project interviews. It exists in the letters that immigrants wrote home to the families they had left behind. Letters that survive in European archives that American historians rarely consult. Letters that describe the processing at Ellis Island in language that would be difficult to reconcile with the Wall of Honor and the museum and the story about the Golden Door. It exists in the memory that was passed down through families, altered slightly with each generation, losing specific details, but retaining the essential shape of what happened, the shape that the woman in the Brooklyn apartment spent 62 years trying to preserve intact. She preserved it because she knew something that the official history has never been willing to say out loud. She knew that the name they gave her at that desk was not a mistake. She knew it was a decision, and she knew that the difference between a mistake and a decision is the difference between something that can be forgiven and something that needs to be understood. To understand why the name changes were decisions rather than mistakes, you have to understand the political climate in which the Ellis Island processing system was designed and operated, because Ellis Island did not exist in a vacuum. It was created by a specific piece of legislation, the Immigration Act of 1891, which for the first time placed immigration enforcement under direct federal control and established the infrastructure for processing and excluding immigrants at the national level. Before 1891, immigration was largely managed at the state level, inconsistently with wide variation in how different ports handled the people arriving at them. The federal takeover was presented as a modernization, a rationalization of a chaotic system, an effort to bring order and consistency to a process that had been operating without adequate oversight. And in purely administrative terms, that is exactly what it was. But administrative modernization does not happen in a political vacuum either. It happens in response to political pressures. And the political pressures that produced the Immigration Act of 1891 were not primarily about efficiency. They were about fear. Specifically, they were about the fear widespread among the native-born Anglo-Protestant population of the United States in the last decades of the 19th century that the country was being changed in ways that were irreversible and threatening by the arrival of people who were too different, too foreign, too Catholic, too Jewish, too Eastern European, too Southern European, too attached to languages and traditions that did not fit the self-image of the nation, as it had been caught the Kate the Caquip Pekon. As it had caught. This fear had a name. It was called nativism. And nativism in the 1890s was not a fringe position held by extremists. It was a mainstream political force with representation in Congress, with funding from wealthy industrialists, with academic respectability provided by the newly emerging field of eugenics, and with a clear and articulable policy agenda that centered on controlling, limiting, and where possible reversing the demographic transformation that unrestricted immigration was producing. The Immigration League was founded in 1894, 3 years after the federal takeover of immigration enforcement and 2 years after Ellis Island opened. Its founders were Harvard-educated Boston Brahmins, men from families that had been in America for generations, men who were not operating from ignorance or poverty or the kind of desperate economic anxiety that sometimes drives nativist movements. They were operating from a considered position informed by the eugenic science of the period that certain kinds of people were simply less desirable as additions to the American population than others, and that the state had both the right and the obligation to make that determination systematically. They lobbied for literacy tests. They lobbied for national origin quotas. They lobbied for the expansion of the excludable categories that immigration inspectors were authorized to enforce. And they had significant influence on the policy environment within which the Ellis Island processing system operated. This is the context in which the name change pattern needs to be understood, not as the isolated decisions of individual inspectors acting on personal prejudice or working too fast to be careful, but as the operational expression of a policy environment that had decided, at a level well above the individual inspector, that the people arriving at that island needed to be transformed in specific ways before they could be permitted to enter. The transformation of the name was the most immediate and the most symbolically significant version of a broader transformation that the system was designed to produce. A person whose name had been changed was already, at the moment they walked off the island, a different person than the one who had arrived. They were already inhabiting an identity that had been constructed for them by the receiving country rather than carried by them from the country they came from. They were already, in the most literal administrative sense, who America had decided they were going to be. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment understood this not as a political analysis but as a lived experience. She had felt it in her body. The specific wrongness of answering to a name that was not hers, the way it created a small but persistent dislocation between who she knew herself to be and who every official interaction told her she was. She described this feeling to Dora, and Dora described it to the Federal Writers Project researcher, and the researcher wrote it down in language that is worth sitting with, even across the distance of 80 years. She said it was like wearing shoes that were almost the right size. Not so wrong that you could not walk, wrong enough that you never forgot with any step that the shoes were not yours. That description, shoes that were almost the right size, as a more precise account of what the name change system did to the people who went through it than anything in the official administrative record. Because the official administrative record does not have a category for the experience of inhabiting an assigned identity. It has categories for names. It has columns and rows and entry numbers. It has the efficient notation of a processing system that was designed to move large numbers of people through a building quickly and produce a legible record of who they were on the other side. What it does not have, what it was never designed to have, is any account of what it felt like to be the person being processed. That account exists only in the oral testimony, in the tin boxes, in the letters, in the 2,900 Federal Writers Project interviews that have been sitting in federal archives for 8 decades waiting for someone to treat them as the primary evidence they are rather than the supplementary color they have been classified as. The Immigration Restriction League got most of what it wanted eventually. The Immigration Act of 1924 established the national origin quota system that effectively cut off immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe for the next 4 decades. By the time that law passed, the political and intellectual framework that the League had been building since 1894 had become official policy. The fear had been institutionalized, and the Ellis Island processing system, which had been operating within that political environment for 30 years, had done its part. 12 million people had been processed. Millions of names had been altered. And the record of what had happened was distributed between official archives that reflected the system's account of itself, and tin boxes under beds in Brooklyn apartments that reflected the account of the people the system had processed. Only one of those accounts has been treated as history. The other one is still waiting. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a family when the person who remembered everything is gone. It is not the silence of forgetting. It is the silence of knowing that something was known and is now unreachable, that there was a version of the story that existed in one person's memory and died with them, and that what remains is only the outline of that story, the shape of it without the substance, the container without the contents. Every family that passed through Ellis Island in those years carries some version of this silence. It lives in the gap between what the grandparents said and what the grandchildren were able to retain, in the questions that were never asked while there was still someone alive who could answer them, in the tin boxes that were eventually thrown away because nobody was quite sure what they contained or why they mattered. Dora did not throw away the tin box. This is what makes her unusual and what makes the testimony she gave to the Federal Writers Project researcher in 1938 a document of particular significance. Most families, by the time the Federal Writers Project researchers came knocking in the late 1930s, had already lost the most direct connection to the immigration experience. The people who had actually made the crossing were elderly or gone. The children they had raised in America were fully assimilated, Americans in language and habit and self-identification, often deliberately disconnected from the old world their parents had come from, because disconnection had seemed, in the early decades of the 20th century, like the price of belonging. The grandchildren were even further removed. They knew the broad outlines of the family story, the country of origin, the approximate year of arrival, the name of the ship if they were lucky, but the specific texture of the experience, what it felt like to stand in that registry room, what the inspector said, what the name on the entry card said, versus what the name on the manifest said, that level of detail had usually not survived the transmission. Dora had it because her grandmother had made a deliberate decision to preserve it, not in the passive way that memory sometimes survives, not because nobody got around to discarding it, but because the woman in the Brooklyn apartment had spent 62 years actively maintaining the story, repeating it, insisting on its details, refusing the simplifications that would have made it easier to tell, but less true to what had actually happened. She had done this in the face of considerable pressure to let it go. Her children, American-born and American-educated, had found the story embarrassing in the way that immigrant families of that generation often found the old world embarrassing, as evidence of a foreignness they were working hard to leave behind. Her neighbors had found it tedious, the grievance of an old woman who could not accept that America was a country you were supposed to be grateful for, regardless of how it had treated you. Even Dora, who loved her grandmother and kept the tin box, admitted to the Federal Writers Project researcher that there had been years in her youth when she had wished her grandmother would simply stop talking about the name. But the grandmother did not stop. And the reason she did not stop, the reason she kept returning to the story with the same insistence decade after decade, is something that the Federal Writers Project transcript captures in a single exchange that is worth examining closely. The researcher asked her, toward the end of the interview, why she thought it was important that people know about what had happened to her name, and she said, according to the transcript, that it was not about her name specifically. It was about what her name represented. Her name was the proof that she had existed before America decided who she was. It was the evidence that there had been a self prior to the processing, a person with a history and a family and a place in the world that was hers before it was anyone else's to alter. And if that proof disappeared, if the name was forgotten and the tin box was thrown away and the story stopped being told, then the processing would be complete, not just for her, for everyone who had gone through that system, because a processing that nobody remembered was a processing that had fully succeeded. This is a profound observation. It is also, when you sit with it, a deeply unsettling one, because it means that the silence that settles over a family when the person who remembered everything is gone is not neutral. It is not simply the natural result of time passing and memory fading. It is the completion of something that was begun at a wooden desk on a small island in New York Harbor. The alteration of the name was the first step. The forgetting of the original name was the last step, and everything in between, the assimilation pressure, the embarrassment about the old country, the deliberate disconnection from a past that felt like a liability, all of it was the middle of a process that was designed, at its inception, to produce exactly this outcome, a population that had been remade and did not remember being remade. A population that carried the new identity as if it had always been theirs, because the evidence of the exchange had been lost. The Federal Writers Project was, in this context, something more than a New Deal employment program for out-of-work writers. It was, at least in the immigration testimonies it collected, an accidental preservation effort. The researchers who conducted those interviews were not, for the most part, thinking about what they were doing in these terms. They were following a methodology, filling out forms, meeting their quotas of completed interviews. But what they captured in those 2,900 testimonies was the last moment before the silence became complete, the last window in which the people who had been processed were still alive and still talking and still insisting, as the woman in the Brooklyn apartment had insisted for 62 years, that the story was not the one that had been officially recorded. She died in the spring of 1949. Dora kept the tin box, and somewhere in a federal archive in Washington, in a box that is technically accessible and functionally invisible, the transcript of what she said is still waiting for the silence to end. The year 1924 is a dividing line in American immigration history that most people have heard of without fully understanding what it divides. On one side of that line is the period of mass immigration, the decades between the 1880s and the early 1920s, when somewhere between 20 and 25 million people arrived in the United States from Europe, the largest voluntary human migration in recorded history up to that point. On the other side is the period of restriction, the 4 decades during which the national origin quota system established by the Immigration Act of 1924 effectively reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to a trickle, cutting off the flow of people that had been transforming American cities and American culture and American demographics for 40 years. The line between those two periods is sharp and clean in the official history. Before 1924, the door was open. After 1924, it was nearly closed. The story is told as a policy shift, a legislative decision, a change in the law. What the official history does not tell you is what happened in the years immediately before that line was drawn, in the early 1920s, when it was becoming clear that the restriction legislation was coming and that the window for mass entry was closing. Because in those years the Ellis Island processing system did not slow down, it accelerated. The numbers of people arriving in those final years of open immigration were among the highest the station had ever processed, and the processing itself, the inspection system, the name recording, the entry documentation, became in those years simultaneously more pressured and more consequential. More pressured because the volume was enormous and the staff was the same size it had always been. More consequential because the people arriving in those years were arriving into a country that was in the process of formally deciding it did not want them, and the record being created of their arrival was being created in that political atmosphere by inspectors who were operating within an institutional culture that had been shaped by 30 years of nativist pressure. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment arrived in 1887, which puts her in the earlier period before the nativist movement had fully consolidated its political power, before the Immigration Restriction League had been founded, before eugenics had become academic respectability rather than fringe theory. But the system that processed her was already operating according to the logic that would eventually produce the 1924 Act. The logic was present in the design of the building, in the chalk marking system, in the way the manifest verification worked, in the specific pressures that produced the name change pattern. The 1924 Act did not create that logic. It formalized it. It turned a set of practices and attitudes and institutional habits into explicit law, and in doing so it also created the dividing line that has allowed the official history to treat what happened before it as a separate, more innocent period than what came after. This separation is one of the most consequential pieces of historical framing in the entire Ellis Island story, because it positions the mass immigration period as the golden era, the time of the open door and the huddled masses and the genuine welcome, and positions the restriction period as the regrettable but ultimately corrected deviation from American values. The 1965 Immigration Act, which abolished the national origin quota system, is celebrated in the official history as the restoration of the true American tradition. The arc bends toward justice. The mistake is acknowledged and reversed. The story ends well. Except that the story does not end well for the 12 million names that were altered during the Golden Era. The story does not end well for the families who carried those altered names for generations without knowing exactly what had been done or why. The story does not end well for the 2,900 Federal Writers Project testimonies sitting in boxes in federal archives, undigitized and uncited, because the information they contain does not fit inside the arc that bends toward justice. You cannot celebrate the restoration of the open door while simultaneously acknowledging that the open door was never as open as it looked, that it had a processing system built into it that was designed to transform the people walking through it in ways they did not consent to and were not informed of. The celebration requires the incomplete version of the story, and the incomplete version of the story requires the 2,900 testimonies to remain where they are. There is a researcher, a woman who spent 15 years working in immigration history before leaving academia, who has written about this problem in terms that are direct enough to be worth noting. She has argued that the standard periodization of American immigration history, the division into the open door era and the restriction era, functions primarily as a protective frame for the institutions and the descendant communities that benefited from the mass immigration period. It allows those communities to claim the immigration story as a story of American generosity and immigrant resilience, without having to reckon with the specific mechanisms by which the immigrants were processed, the specific ways in which their identities were managed and altered, and in some cases deliberately erased. The frame is generous to the receiving country and silent about what the receiving country actually did. She is not the only person who has made this argument. She is one of a small number of historians and archivists who have been making versions of it for years, in journals that specialize in immigration history, in conference papers that circulate among a narrow academic audience, in footnotes and appendices that the general public never reads. The argument exists. It has been made carefully and with substantial documentary support. It has simply not made it into the version of the story that gets told to the general public, the version that ends with the arc bending toward justice and the door opening again in 1965 and the mistakes of the restriction era being officially acknowledged and corrected. Because correcting the mistakes of the restriction era is manageable, it requires changing a law. Acknowledging what happened during the golden era is considerably harder. It requires changing a story, and stories, especially stories that have been told for long enough and believed deeply enough and built into enough walls of honor and museum exhibits and national mythologies, do not change easily. They change only when the evidence that contradicts them becomes impossible to ignore. When the tin boxes get opened, when the transcripts get read, when the 2,900 testimonies finally get treated as the primary evidence they are. That moment has not arrived yet, but the evidence is still there, technically accessible, and getting harder to keep invisible. There is a question that surfaces inevitably when you spend enough time with this material, when you have read enough of the Federal Writers Project testimonies and traced enough of the documentary gaps and sat long enough with the specific pattern of what has been preserved and what has been obscured. The question is this: who benefits? Not in the abstract, ideological sense of who benefits from a national mythology that presents the immigration experience as a story of welcome and resilience and eventual inclusion. That answer is relatively straightforward. Everyone who has a stake in the mythology benefits from its maintenance, which in a country where the immigration story is foundational to the national self-image means nearly everyone, but that is too broad to be useful. The more specific question is who benefits from the particular obscurity of these particular documents, from the specific invisibility of these specific 2,900 testimonies, from the ongoing inaccessibility of the evidence that would most directly complicate the official version of what happened at Ellis Island during the years of mass immigration. The answer to that specific question requires looking at what the testimonies actually contain, beyond the name change pattern, beyond the individual family stories, beyond the tin boxes and the polite erasures. Because the Federal Writers Project immigration testimonies are not only about names, They are about the entire processing experience, and the picture of that experience that emerges from them, when you read them as a body rather than as isolated accounts, is considerably more systematic than any individual testimony alone would suggest. They describe, collectively, a processing system that was not merely inefficient or overburdened or culturally insensitive. They describe a system that was making consequential decisions about people's identities, their admissibility, their family separations, and their futures in America according to criteria that were never made explicit, never subject to appeal, and never fully documented in the official record. The family separation testimonies are among the most difficult to read. They appear across dozens of the 2,900 interviews in different cities, in different ethnic communities, describing variations on the same experience. A family arrives together. During the inspection process, one member is separated from the others. Sometimes it is a child who has been chalk-marked for further medical inspection. Sometimes it is an adult who has given an answer that the inspector found unsatisfactory. Sometimes the separation is explained, in the vague institutional language of the processing system, as a temporary measure pending further review. And sometimes the separated person does not come back. They are detained. They are deported. They are sent to a hospital facility on the island from which they eventually return, weeks later, changed in ways that the family cannot fully account for. Or they do not return at all. And the family, already in America, already beginning the process of building a new life, is left with a gap where a person used to be, and an official record that does not fully explain what happened to fill it. The official statistics on Ellis Island detentions and deportations are available. They are part of the Bureau of Immigration annual reports that are housed in federal archives and have been partially incorporated into the academic literature. The numbers are significant. Between 1892 and 1954, roughly 2% of all arrivals were deported, which sounds like a small percentage until you apply it to 12 million people and understand that it represents somewhere between 240,000 and 350,000 individuals who made the crossing and did not stay. But the statistics do not capture what the testimonies capture. They do not capture what it felt like to be the family member who was admitted while another family member was not. They do not capture the specific bureaucratic opacity of the process by which those decisions were made, the way that inspectors and medical officers operated with enormous discretionary authority and minimal accountability, making determinations that could end a family's plan for reunion, or begin a decades-long effort to understand what had happened and why. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment was not separated from her family at Ellis Island. She arrived with her mother and her 2 younger brothers, and they were all admitted, all processed, all given their entry cards with their altered names, and they made their way to the ferry terminal where her father was waiting. She was one of the lucky ones, if lucky is the right word for someone whose name was changed without her consent at the age of 7. But she knew families who had not been lucky in that way. She knew women in her Brooklyn neighborhood whose husbands had been detained, whose children had been held for medical inspection that stretched into weeks, whose experience of the Golden Door had included a period of separation and uncertainty that the official history of Ellis Island does not prominently feature because it does not fit inside the story of welcome. She talked about these families in her testimony. She named them, though the Federal Writers Project researcher, following the project's standard privacy protocols, recorded the names in a separate index that has been even harder to locate than the main testimony transcripts. She described specific cases with the specificity of someone who had been paying close attention for decades, who had understood that these individual experiences were not isolated misfortunes, but evidence of something systematic. She connected the name changes to the detentions, to the deportations, to the family separations in a way that pointed toward a single conclusion, that the Ellis Island processing system was not a welcome center that sometimes made mistakes. It was a sorting mechanism, and the criteria by which it sorted were not the criteria it advertised. The criteria it advertised were the ones written into the immigration laws: excludable conditions, medical defects, criminal history, anarchist beliefs, polygamy. These were the official reasons a person could be turned away. They were the reasons that appeared in the official record when someone was detained or deported. They were the categories that the Bureau of Immigration reported to Congress in its annual statistics. But the testimonies describe a processing system in which the official categories were applied with a flexibility that amounted, in practice, to a much broader discretionary authority. An inspector who wanted to find a reason to detain someone could find one. The categories were wide enough, and the evidentiary standards loose enough, and the appeals process limited enough that the official criteria functioned less as firm legal boundaries and more as a vocabulary for documenting decisions that had already been made on other grounds. This is what the 2,900 testimonies contain that the official record does not. Not just the names, the decisions behind the names, the criteria behind the decisions, the system behind the criteria, and the understanding shared across all those different families and all those different communities that the system had never been quite what it said it was. By the time the woman in the Brooklyn apartment was in her 70s, she had watched the Ellis Island story calcify into something that bore less and less resemblance to what she remembered. She had watched it move from living memory into official history, which is a transition that always involves loss, but in this case involved a specific and identifiable kind of loss. Not the natural erosion of detail that happens when any experience passes from the people who lived it into the hands of the people who write about it. Something more deliberate than that, a selection process, a choosing of which details survived the transition and which ones did not. And what she observed across the decades was that the details that survived were consistently the ones that served the mythology, while the details that did not serve it consistently failed to make the crossing from memory into record. She was not alone in observing this. The Federal Writers Project testimonies, read as a body, reveal a community of observation. Across those 2,900 interviews, across the different cities and neighborhoods and ethnic communities where the researchers worked, there is a recurring awareness among the people being interviewed that the story being told about their experience is not the story they lived, not in every detail, not in ways that would be easy to point to and say, specifically, that is wrong, but in the aggregate, in the overall shape and emotional register of the official version, in the way it consistently positions the immigrants as grateful recipients of American generosity, rather than as people who were processed by a system that had specific interests of its own. The official version and the lived experience do not match, and the people in those interviews know it. They say so in different ways, with different degrees of directness, but the awareness is there. They are watching their own history be written around them and recognizing that what is being written is not quite what happened. This awareness is itself a form of evidence. It is evidence that the gap between the official version and the lived experience was not created retrospectively, not constructed by later generations looking back with critical frameworks that were not available at the time. It was recognized in real time by the people who were living it in the 1930s when the Federal Writers Project researchers were conducting their interviews and the Ellis Island mythology was still in its formative stages. The official story was being built while the people who knew it was incomplete were still alive and still talking. And the 2,900 testimonies are the record of that talking, the record of a community that was watching its history be constructed and trying through the medium of these interviews to insert the version they knew into the version that was being written. They did not succeed, not in the way they would have needed to succeed to change the official version in any lasting way. The testimonies were collected and filed, and the official version continued to be built without them, continued to accumulate the institutional weight of repetition and citation and museum exhibits and school curricula, continued to become more fixed and more authoritative with every passing decade. But the testimonies survived, and their survival, combined with the specific nature of what they contain, means that the gap between the official version and the lived experience is still documentable, still provable, still available to anyone who knows where to look and is willing to treat what they find there as the primary evidence it is. What would it mean to actually reckon with that evidence? This is a question that the academic literature on Ellis Island immigration history has approached cautiously and incompletely, and that the public discourse around immigration and American identity has not approached at all. Because reckoning with it would require something more than adding a footnote to the official history, more than acknowledging in a museum exhibit that the processing system was imperfect and that some immigrants had difficult experiences. It would require a fundamental reorientation of the story, a recognition that the gateway to the American dream was also a sorting mechanism, that the welcome was conditional in ways that were never made explicit, that the names on the wall of honor are in many cases not the names those people were born with, but the names they were assigned, and that the assignment was not accidental, that the golden era of open immigration was simultaneously the era during which millions of people were processed through a system designed to make them legible to the state at the cost of the specific identities they had carried across the ocean. This reorientation would be uncomfortable. It would complicate narratives that have been foundational to how immigrant communities understand their own history and their place in American society. It would require those communities to hold two things simultaneously: the genuine courage and resilience of the people who made the crossing, and the genuine coercion of the system that received them. These things are not mutually exclusive. They can both be true, but holding both of them requires a more complex relationship to the history than the official version has ever demanded. A willingness to see the grandparents and great-grandparents not only as heroes of an inspiring story, but as people who were processed, managed, and in specific ways diminished by a system that was never as welcoming as it presented itself to be. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment held both of those things for 62 years. She was proud of what she had built in America. She was clear-eyed about what it had cost her to build it. She did not experience these two things as contradictory. She experienced them as the complete truth of her life, as opposed to the partial truth that the official version was willing to accommodate. And she spent 62 years trying to pass that complete truth on through Dora, through the tin box, through the stories she told over and over until the details were fixed and the shape was clear and the essential argument was impossible to misunderstand. The argument was not that America was bad. It was not that the immigration experience was only suffering and loss. It was something more precise and more demanding than either of those positions. It was that a story told only from the records of the system that created it is not a complete story. That the people who were processed by that system had an account of it that was different from the system's account of itself. And that the difference between those two accounts, the gap between the official record and the tin box, is where the actual history lives, not the mythology, not the inspiration, the history, the thing that happened, the thing that she remembered, the thing that he still, if you know where to look, available to be found. In the spring of 1949, a few weeks before she died, the woman in the Brooklyn apartment told Dora something she had never said quite so directly before. She said that she was not afraid of being forgotten. She was afraid of being remembered wrong. There is a distinction there that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention, but that contains, once you see it, the entire argument she had been making for 62 years. Being forgotten is a loss. Being remembered wrong is a replacement. It is the installation of a substitute in the place where the true thing used to be, a substitute that looks enough like the original that nobody goes looking for what it replaced. She had been remembered wrong since the age of 7, since the moment the inspector at the wooden desk wrote a different name on her entry card and filed it in the system that would follow her for the rest of her life. And she had spent every year since then trying to ensure that at least one person, at least Dora, at least the researcher who came with his notebook in 1938, understood the difference between the name that was filed and the name that was true. She died without knowing whether it had worked. She died without knowing that the transcript of what Dora told the Federal Writers Project researcher would survive, would make it into the Federal Archive, would still be sitting in a box in Washington decades later, technically accessible and functionally invisible but intact. She died without knowing that the pattern she had spent her life trying to articulate, the pattern of the name changes and the missing records and the polite erasures and the systematic construction of an official history that did not match the lived experience, would eventually become documentable from multiple directions simultaneously, through the testimonies and the shipping records and the European archives and the administrative correspondence that survived in forms the original architects of the system did not anticipate. She died not knowing whether the complete truth she had tried to preserve would ever find its way into the version of the story that the world was willing to hear. But here is what she did know. She knew that the evidence existed. She knew that the tin box was real, and the transcript was real, and the original name, the name she was born with, the name that the inspector had replaced with something more convenient, was real, was still real, had not stopped being real simply because the official record did not contain it. She knew that reality does not require official acknowledgement to remain real. And she knew that as long as one person remembered the difference between what was filed and what was true, the processing was not complete. The system had altered her name. It had not altered her knowledge of what her name had been. And that knowledge, passed to Dora, passed to the researcher, passed now through a transcript in a federal archive to anyone willing to go looking for it, was the thing that the system had never fully been able to reach. This is what makes the Federal Writers Project immigration testimonies significant beyond their historical content. They are not just a record of what happened to 12 million people during the years of mass immigration. They are a record of resistance, a record of people who understood that the official version of their experience was incomplete and who chose, in the specific medium available to them in the late 1930s, to insert the version they knew into the historical record. They did not have the institutional power to change the official history. They did not have the resources to mount a legal challenge to the name change system or the deportation records or the chalk-marking process. What they had was their testimony, their memory, their insistence that the thing they knew had happened was the thing that had happened, regardless of what the entry card said. That insistence is still sitting in those boxes, all totally 900 testimonies of it. Waiting not for someone to rescue it because it does not need rescuing. It is intact, it has survived, it is there. Waiting for something simpler and more demanding than rescue. Waiting for someone to read it. To sit with it long enough to understand what it contains. To treat the words of the people who were processed by that system as evidence of what the system actually did, rather than as supplementary color for a story that has already been decided. Waiting for the gap between the official record and the tin box to finally be acknowledged as the place where the actual history lives. The woman in the Brooklyn apartment spent 62 years trying to keep that gap open. She told the story over and over because she knew that stories, told often enough and carefully enough, can survive the people who tell them. She was right about that. The story survived her. It is in the transcript. It is in the tin box that Dora kept under her bed. It is in the pattern that connects her experience to the experiences of the millions of others who went through that same system in those same years and left behind the same kind of fragmented, technically accessible, functionally invisible evidence of what was actually done to them. You have been told the Ellis Island story. You have seen the photographs and walked through the museum and read the names on the wall. You have been given the version that the official record supports, the version that ends with the arc bending toward justice and the door opening and the mistakes being corrected. That version is not false. It is incomplete. And the part that is missing is not missing because the evidence does not exist. It is missing because the evidence has been sitting in boxes, and because treating it as real would require changing not just a footnote, but a story that a lot of people have a lot invested in keeping the way it is. The transcript of what Dora said is in the Library of Congress. The 2,900 testimonies are in the Federal Archive. The tin box, or what it represents, is still under the bed. The complete truth of what happened on that island to those 12 million people in those names that were changed, and those families that were separated, and those records that burned, and those documents that were filed in ways designed to make them hard to find, that truth is not lost, it is waiting. Sitting in a filing cabinet, in a box, in a building that is technically open to the public, waiting for someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually said, instead of what we have always been told they should have remembered. This is Liturgy of Whispers, and we will keep reading until the complete truth has nowhere left to hide